morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Beath, and I'm with Maximus. And I'd like to first thank David and those great panelists for all their great discussion. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next moderator, Industry Co-Chair for this event, Martha Doris, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of DCI. Martha will be moderating our final session, Technology Modernization Fund, TMF Update, which will be a fireside chat. Our first two panelists, Rajiv Mathur, Deputy Commissioner and Chief Information Officer, Office of Systems, Office of the Commissioner, Social Security Administration, and Charles Worthington, Chief Technology Officer, Veterans Administration.
Get it all together here. And thank you, Lisa. Good morning. My name is Tony Ogden, and I'm with ServiceNow. So it's my pleasure to introduce the final two panelists. First is Matthew Cutts. So Matthew is the administrator. He's also the deputy CIO of our U.S. Digital Services at OMB. And second is Ms. Margaret. Margaret is the Federal Deputy Chief Information Officer.
Welcome to the last panel of the day, and we're thrilled to have such an illustrious group of people to join us to talk about the intersection of IT modernization and customer experience. And I think that, when we were planning this summit, the thing that we wanted to do is bring together the two issues of how the experience that customers want, both internally and externally, to drive IT modernization, or at least have an impact in IT modernization. So why don't we get started right away? And I'll start with Margaret. Margie, please. Margie. I haven't been called Margaret.
Only when my mother was mad.
So to kind of set the stage, why don't you give us a little bit of background on the Modernizing Government Technology Act and how that kind of enables this work?
You want to get the key tenets of the act. Okay, so the problem we were trying to solve was there didn't seem to be the correct funding flexibilities that would allow people to take a true modernization journey, because that journey is usually multi-year. And people needed seed money, call it over-the-top money, call it seed money, call it whatever you want to call it. But in actuality, operational funds and sometimes programmatic budgeting cycles did not allow them to actually pull that kind of money forward for the kinds of changes that we were talking about. Because we have a lot of embedded legacy IT, we need to make dramatic changes. So the thought was that we needed some kind of a revolving fund or capability both within agencies and at the federal enterprise level that would allow us to access that capital that was needed to make the kinds of transformations that we're talking about. So within the Act itself, we have a provision that allows agencies to establish working capital funds and to transfer funding into those working capital funds related to multi-year modernization efforts. And then also at the federal level, establishing the Technology Modernization Fund and the board that supports it. And that board is comprised of several of the individuals that you see on the panel today. And they have backgrounds in technology, acquisition, budgeting, etc. So we brought disciplines from the entire C-suite into the equation so that we could have those effective discussions.
Thank you. And I think, as Margie mentioned, bringing the IT, experience and the digital services experience and the acquisition experience, I think to this panel as well as to the board. I'm sure you will look at things a little bit differently when you're reviewing applications that come in. I wanted to talk to all of you about what are you looking for and the types of projects that you're getting into the board. And why don't I start on the other end with Rajiv, and like when you're looking at it, what kind of input do you give the board on what makes a good project?
So the process, for those of you who may or may not know, is that we have a PMO that's run by GSA that shepherds the projects and the ideas forward. They work with the teams to figure out and vet the idea, vet the concept, make sure that it's appropriately the level of detail for us. And once we do get a chance to review the details of that, I look for a number of things. And I think we've all, over the last couple of years now, we've all figured out our own kind of sweet spots of what we all look for. So I can pretty much predict what Charles is going to ask, and I'm sure he can probably do the same for me. But I look for commitment from the agency. I mean, that says that in the paperwork, but is there commitment from the agency on this effort? And when I say agency, I mean certainly the leadership from the agency or the federal entity, but really business and IT, because it is IT modernization, but the success depends on making sure that you have business partnership in the room. In fact, I've asked for that when they actually come in for the second round, to make sure we have those kind of one voice jointly coming in together. I know our colleagues at SSA that are here have heard me say the same thing at SSA. One conversation, not two, a single-threaded conversation. I also look for how is it going to impact the customer, and I look at myself. I look at how is it going to touch the American public. And in many cases, at least the early ones that we've seen, are affecting the employee first, the employee experience first, not the public. And so that's the question of where is this going to head? I ask ourselves, I ask the question, where is it going to head? Beyond this, is there another phase that could then affect the public experience? So those are kind of two things that I look for, two or three that I look for. But back to you.
Yeah, Matt?
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating experience. I think if you take a step back, you're looking at how can you improve services to the public? Ideally, how can you make things more secure? And then along the way, you're often saving money. And it needs to make sense whenever you have a project proposal along a lot of different axes. So I think if you look at the original stuff, people are like, does it make financial sense? Does it make technical sense? Does it make operational sense? And what I really appreciate and love about the board is that different people bring different strengths to the board. So, I'm not a finance guy, but you've got Alan Thomas over at GSA, right? And I just passed 3 years in government, so I'm not going to know as much operationally as Margie or Rajiv or Maria wrote about making sure that things work well. But having spent 17 years as an engineer, being able to kick the tires on the technical aspect is really interesting to me. Certainly, if there is public impact, that's fascinating. And then for me, I also have a preference to look at the quality of the team. So, has somebody done something along the lines before? Or, do we have the federal muscle, the federal capacity? So it's not just we find a good contractor, the contractor takes care of everything. What are the lessons learned? Where is the capacity within the federal government? So that hopefully we can enlarge that capacity going forward as well. Those are some of the things.
Thank you.
I think the panel's already mentioned a lot of the topics, but maybe one that I'll cover that I wind up really looking for as a product designer is a real understanding, I think, in the proposal of what the problem that they're trying to solve is, and not over-prescribing the solution or the plan, but rather basically I want to see in the plan that that they are going to be delivering something quickly. So I'm not looking for a plan to make a plan, or a plan to come up with an acquisition strategy, to hire someone to make the plan, to then ship phase 1 in 2021, right? I think the panel is all looking for what are we going to get in 3 months, what will be different in 3 months from what it is today, and then are we confident that the team can continue to execute based on what they learn after that first chunk of time to make incremental progress. So I think iterative and agile delivery is a key component that a lot of agencies have seen success with. But I think sometimes agencies just kind of map that word to their existing, come up with a full 36-month plan with milestones all along the way of when they're going to deliver everything, and that's not usually that appealing to me. I'm really interested in what's the plan for what we can deliver first, and then do we have a good process in place that we have confidence in that we'll be continuing to deliver after that.
I would say too that we are looking for things that have impact across the federal government. So if we have a first mover who's going to be moving off a mainframe and is going to light the pathway for others that have that similar issue across the federal government, and is going to provide a playbook or a methodology or a capability that can be utilized by many other agencies along the way, that's really a good indicator of something that we ought to take on at the enterprise level. There are a couple of our agencies that are doing that right now, one moving off of a mainframe, one adopting cloud. All of those kinds of things are happening.
Do you want to give us a few? I'm going to go back down the line in terms of examples of some of those projects that you guys have blessed and kind of how they're going.
Sure.
So the one that I was talking about, moving off a mainframe, is actually HUD. They're modernizing their loan processing capability, and they have agreed to document the steps in their journey, talk about their successes, highlight areas where there might be pitfalls, and to share that with the community going forward. We just recently had an update from them. They're doing very well. They've delivered on their first cycle, which I think gives us confidence going forward that they'll continue to be successful. That's just one example.
Yeah, I always like the ones that have really compelling before and after screenshots of what the experience is for the users of the system. So there's a few going on at Department of Agriculture right now that are modernizing systems that USDA employees use, but also those same systems can be the systems that will power the front end experience for farmers and people that work with farmers. And so I think that project in particular has some really compelling improvements to user experience that are exciting to me. They're trying to make things much faster for the employees to process work.
You can see how the stars are aligning between GSA, COEs, TMF funding, and kind of the agencies that are really trying to pull it all together to actually improve or modernize their systems as well as improve the experience.
That's right. And I think something Margie emphasized is also one of the real values we're seeing about the TMF is we're learning things from agencies, and agencies, I think, are learning a little bit from each other, both by talking to the board, but also just talking to each other. And I'd love to see even more of that. I think, a couple of years ago now, it was the Department of Agriculture Farmers.gov team reached out to some of the VA's team that had worked on the Vets.gov project and just asked for some lessons learned as they were about to embark on that journey. I think there's a ton of commonalities in the problems, obviously, that the federal government's facing. And we all like to think of our agencies as unique, special snowflakes, which, VA is, but none of the rest of them. But really, they are facing a lot of the same challenges. A lot of us are running on mainframes, or a lot of us have internal customer-facing systems that were built in the 90s with no designers at all and no thought to how the user experience would be. And so the tactics we use to improve them, I think, are also similar.
Well, I think capturing those lessons learned and sharing them with other agencies is going to pay dividends down the road, so they're not reinventing the wheel. So I think that's a great benefit that I hadn't realized until we were talking yesterday, which makes good sense.
Yeah. Well, and to take that point and echo on a little bit, I think we're still in the early days, right?
Right.
People are still in the initial cycles, but the board is asking with good regularity, how will you document this so that other people can benefit? To sort of get to Margie's point about cross-cutting initiatives across government. One of the things that has really been a favorite for me is I am not a fan of paper. I think things primarily ought to be electronic instead of paper. And so there's a project that the Department of Labor is doing with certifications for visas. And instead of having blue security paper being mailed between different agencies, the idea of going electronic, so you can have an API, an application programming interfaces, which is just a standard or protocol so two computers can talk to each other. And that's really an interesting project because it also pulls in USCIS, it pulls in State Department, and so cutting across what can often feel like silos within government. And that's an interesting case in a lot of things. It's not just moving to electronic, but it's also figuring out, okay, how do we make sure that you best communicate, this is what the approximate timeline is, how do you pull, and make sure that other agencies are well informed so that they can do their planning on their side. And also it'll just result in more security, it'll result in lower prices, just a really good template for.
Well, the last panel really hit home, I think, the value of, right now everybody's looking at doing their agency improvements, but I'm sure as you guys move forward, you'll be looking for projects that cross agencies so that we can look at those major journeys that the citizens are having with government that cross multiple agencies to be able to improve the, efficiency and the experience for them too as well. I want to finish with Rajiv, but then I want to talk about these cycles that you guys are talking about, because I don't know if the audience understands how the cycles go. I don't, and would love to hear about it. So Rajiv,
Yeah, so just building off what you just said, we do look for how does a particular investment scale to more than one agency. That's questions always asked. One of the ones that we funded most recently was NewPay, which is a new shared service for the government. Currently, there are 4 providers that you all may know, some of you may know, across federal agencies, and in light of all these externalities that happen where payroll providers currently need to be tweaked and cycles may need to be tweaked. I mean, the government shutdown was a big challenge for what we all went through. The new shared service is a shared service of payrolls, for payroll, a subscription-based service for payroll for federal agencies. So there's the exciting part is the one experience. The second exciting part is we've thought through, and the team thought through the migration of how do agencies think about migrating to this new shared service. That's a big part of modernization and funding. Questions that we asked, but okay, you might develop something, fine, but then how do you get people to sign on to it and actually use it? So that's pretty exciting. Another one, which, when it first came in, it struck me as why are we talking about this, was email to the cloud. I mean, Max Everett over at Energy is faced with 64 different email systems, which I think, half or 2/3 were on-prem and the rest were somewhere in the cloud. Well, we don't know which cloud, I'm sure Max knows. But the point is, there was a number, I think it was over 100,000 mailboxes, and it's one of those things that came into us and as a modernization project. On the maturity scale for where energy was and is, that was the right thing for them to do. And that was one of the conversations we had, is how do we help them along with this really important hump that shows value to the employee, it actually saves money, but it also shows that, hey, you can actually do something as an agency-wide effort. So those are 2.
those are great. So, Margie, maybe you want to talk about like the cycles that you go through. I know, and of course the fund needs to be paid back. I mean, when you get funding, so
That's a very important point.
so just describe that what the cycle looks like, the payback period, those kind of things.
Well, I think what we do is we look for combination platters, and what I mean by that is when an agency has that leadership that has the dramatic support for what they're trying to accomplish, and Rajiv mentioned that at the outset when we were talking about the Department of Agriculture. It was very clear from the get-go that they wanted to change the conversation with the American farmer, and everything that they're doing is lining up against that. We are a small seed funding portion of them doing proof points of being able to change that customer experience, being able to re-platform, being able to use certain technologies that have that immediate impact on their constituency. And by doing that, ironically enough, they start to get more support in other areas in terms of the normal budgeting process, in terms of visibility with Congress about their success. I think it's a combo platter in the sense that you're looking for all sources of funds to be able to completely take this modernization journey. The TMF is one tool in the toolbox. Your internal working capital fund is another. Your primary budgeting process is another. So you have to look at all of those and pull them all together in a strategic view in order to complete the process. We iterate, so we oftentimes ask, when we're having these conversations in the board, people will come in with a bigger number, and they'll want to complete a couple of segments, and we say, well, what can you do with the smaller amount of money, but a higher level proof point? And those conversations are very valuable because people will work through our GSA PMO, and they'll come back to the table and say, well, you know, if you can help us do this, it will really accelerate us by 9 months, a year, whatever. So getting as many of those into the equation for as many agencies is one of the goals of the TMF.
Yeah, the overall process for agencies to engage with the fund, I think is pretty unique and hopefully a pretty good process. We're pretty proud of it. We spent a lot of time thinking about it, but we tried to make the barrier of entry very low. So to initially propose an idea to the fund, it's really just a 2-page document that your team should be able to create just in an afternoon. Some of them come in longer than that, or they're really small font. So, but really what we're looking for is just a high level, like what's the problem you're trying to solve, and the overall premise of how you intend to solve it, and that's enough to get the conversation started. Then from there, the board can assess the idea, maybe ask some follow-up questions, or invite the team back for what we would call the phase 2. The pitch, and that's an in-person, more in-depth review, a little longer document, but still not this extensive project plan or anything like that. And that's really the chance for the board to ask questions live with the team. We make our funding decisions after that, and then I think one other thing that's unique is that this is not really just a one-time grant of the money. It's a plan over time, and so the money doesn't go all at once. It goes in pieces, and we get regular updates from the teams that come back and talk about their progress, maybe highlight barriers that they're hitting, or lessons learned that we can share with the rest of the projects that we're funding. And then we also discuss, are they ready for the next tranche of funding, which every project's a little different in terms of what the finance looks like. So I think we've awarded $89 million in potential funds, but that doesn't mean we've already transferred all that money, right? That will get meted out over time, and also agencies will start paying back the fund as their projects start paying back. And I think that's one kind of thing that's interesting about the TMF, is that it really is designed to show that flywheel approach of, maybe you have something that's very expensive and you think that a little bit of investment now will help you reduce that time, that cost over time. So we are really looking for projects that fit that model, and that obviously doesn't describe every good idea in government, not even by a long shot. But because our funding model is intended to be basically entirely paid back, we're not making grants, we are making basically loans, and you pay it back over time. But the hope is that that little capital is enough to get the project modernized to a state that it can save money, and then obviously hopefully have some other downstream positive impacts that we use those savings to fund the next wave. So that model, that flywheel model, I think is something that Congress was really excited about when they created the TMF. And TMF is one way to do that, but obviously agencies themselves, a lot of them have working capital funds or can kind of work with Congress on that same idea.
Yeah, my one question was, when do you see, or do you all ever advise agencies that there should be a different model? Like, it's a good project, but it just doesn't fit into...
There's different reasons that can come up. I guess one is if the sense of the payback isn't that direct. Sometimes that can make it maybe not be a great fit for the fund. Also,
so you guys are like loan officers, right?
Yeah, a little. Well, we don't spend too much time on that. The PMO does a good job of kind of working with the agencies on that. The other thing is that the TMF very explicitly is not intended to fund things that Congress has already looked at and decided not to fund. So it's not basically a second chance to get your idea funded. So
it's not
That's
really
a great point. I remember reading that.
It's not really for programmatics. I mean, you should be going through your normal budgeting process and some of that. But the other thing I wanted to mention is we have this term called revert. And what that means is it goes back to the PMO, and the PMO works with the agency in order to improve their approach or their proposal, or to decide if they could do some things with less money. We have gotten feedback from the agencies that have worked with us that that process is just as valuable as the board experience itself, because it creates a discipline and a methodology and an ability to articulate your business case and get better and better at it. So with whatever forum that you present in the future, you've really kicked the tires on it. You've really considered everything. It's almost like we're instilling a methodology and a discipline and a rigor into the process that should be part of your normal portfolio.
Yeah, years and years ago, I was involved in the GSA oversight process, and same thing, right? It just having it there encourages agencies to set up their own processes and do a better job.
Margie said earlier that the TMF is just one part of the portfolio for funding for an agency. It's really not about the money, actually. If you think about it, yes, we're called, the entity is the fund, and there's certainly funds involved, but the fund is the outcome. But it's the process Margie talked about, the discipline, just going through the process of putting together a proposal. Having the business IT single-threaded conversation. When we ask about CX impact, when we ask about value in the near term, when we ask about making sure that they have an eye on the future, but have an eye on the here and now too. There are all these different things that we talk about in the process. They get to hear it, and they get a chance to hopefully take that back to their investment process at their agency and use it. So I would think that, and I think we also talk about this because each agency has a different maturity of where they are in the process, where they are in their conversations across the agency. So how do we then figure out a way to put the funding at the right place to inspire this different thinking and different process and different behavior? Because that's really what it comes down to. In the end, yeah, they get the money and they have to pay it back. But it's all about the process.
I think there's also an interesting amount of value in the signaling aspect to it, and also the communication that comes back such that, it's a relatively well-connected set of folks. You've got folks from OMP, you've got folks who are operationally, at agencies, you've got the GSA, PMO, you've got the federal CIO, of course. So if an agency comes and says, we're having trouble with this specific barrier, that's really useful for us, and we can take that information and say, okay, do we need to push on that further within OMB or on other places, or is there some policy that needs to be changed? So I think there's helpful learnings that come to us as part of the board that then we can help make differences. And I think just going back to the signaling aspect, you can say, oh wait, cloud email migration, how is that like the world of the future? That's not blockchain, that's not AI, whatever. Sorry, I'm joking slightly about blockchain. But it is the case that it's like meat and potatoes. It's like you don't just always want to shoot for grand slam. You need a few singles and doubles and triples. And having the ability to signal, yes, getting secure cloud email is a better customer experience for employees. It leads to better outcomes, probably better security than on-prem. And so I really like that aspect of it because you can also do some really ambitious things. But it's a way for the board to say, here are some things every agency should be thinking about.
I agree with you with the email because, just to think about the impact on your workforce, right? And even people on the outside your customers in terms of trying to find email addresses, which, I'm sure this whole room would agree with finding email addresses with all the different.
Think about it in terms of mission impact too. When there can't be command and control communication in the field operations during a natural disaster between something like the Department of Interior and FEMA during a major fire or things of that nature, communication between multiple law enforcement agencies during a shooting incident or a law enforcement incident like the Boston bombing. Those are the email. It was actually used during those particular, and the Internet of Things and how they pulled in information to actually catch the perpetrators in Boston. You can see it outlined in the movie. That's exactly what they were using, and they had to scale, and they had to scale in the cloud.
I couldn't agree with you more. Years ago for coop drills, we would move our email at GSA to Kansas City during the coop drill and then have to move it back. So going to Google
Yep.
email in the cloud really changed the whole experience, so I agree 100%. I mean, you guys represent, you know, obviously from an O&B and a USDS perspective, you guys are, you know, touching many, many agencies. And then Rajiv is touching, his office is touching every citizen from cradle to grave. VA, you know, is touching veterans and their families. So you add Maria and the small businesses, and this is a really powerful group of people that bring together a lot of experience to help agencies to move to the next level in terms of the modernization and experience. So I'm gonna just ask each of you for like, what are your top 3 recommendations either to your own agency, or if you're looking at either industry here when they're working with agencies, or to agencies on, or what should they be looking for as they're thinking through their modernization strategies and their, you know, they're now submitting action plans as, you know, in response to A11 in terms of improving the customer experience. Anybody want to?
I guess, yeah, I think that the most important thing, or I guess I'll pick 3 things, but the most important thing to start with is to figure out what's the point of the modernization? What outcome are you trying to improve? And the outcomes should be something you can measure. So for example, for our VA, as we did our digital modernization strategy, it was very clear that the outcome we were trying to measure was to increase the use of our self-service tools, our online tools, and to improve our customer experience satisfaction scores. So it was just very helpful to have as a unifying, you know, before we start anything else, these are our goals, and everything else ties to those goals, and we can measure them regularly to see, you know, how we're doing. So I think you have to start with what outcomes you're looking for, and
So like a
hopefully,
future vision of the experience you're trying to provide, is that?
yes, but what is the impact of that experience as something you can measure? And ideally, that outcome is something that matters to the American people. So if it's not, you know, in our case, it was a direct, you know, end user metric, but even if it's an internal facing metric, make it something that that matters, you know, something core to the agency's mission. And then from there, I think the next step is really important to basically talk to the users of the system to figure out what changes could be made to help make progress towards those metrics. So figure out what you're trying to do, and then talk to customers, talk to your users to figure out, you know, what they perceive as the things that would help them make the most amount of progress towards those. And then the third thing is you need to basically configure the way you work so that you can have continuous improvement. We need to basically take action across the board to reduce the cost and difficulty of making changes. So there's tons of processes and tools that are all designed to basically get at that idea of making change easier. You know, things like having automated tests in place and automated deployments. The whole value of that is making it possible to more confidently make changes faster. So that just helps create this culture of continual improvement. So I think if you've got those 3 things, you know, you've got a clear sense of what you're trying to do. You have a process of regularly talking to the users about what they think are the changes you should make, and then you've got both the processes and the tools in place to help you make change fast. That can help set the whole thing off on a pretty good course.
I think a unified business process is something that you have to be conscious of. You've got to lift your head up and look right and look left. The next step in the process may be in another agency. It may be something you have to source from an outside entity and a vendor. It could be anywhere in the equation. And you have to be able to understand the entirety of the end-to-end process and understand, as Charles and I were talking earlier before we came in here, about there are multiple customers in the equation. And you have to go all the way to the end point and say, okay, that's generally the citizen who's having an experience that's either good or bad. But all the way along the chain, there are people who work in that business process who are either adjudicating for a benefit, or they're a customer service representative that's dealing directly with the public, or any number of things along the way. And you have to understand the experience for every one of those and design and architect accordingly so that it is a smooth experience for all. That is something that people don't normally consider. They'll either stop internally and they don't consider the actual end customer, or they're focused on the end customer and they don't understand what happens in between. You have to change both in order to have a unified experience. And there are very few mission spaces today that are wholly contained within one entity in an agency, let alone, within, multiple agencies. So I think that's really,
The panel before yours had some HUD and USDA people, and they talked about their journey maps and, mapping it through the whole kind of CX ecosystem, so that, that's.
yeah, exactly, a good,
Yeah.
it's an event.
I'd use a couple of my points on users. So at US Digital Service, we have a sticker that says, make the user unavoidable. Like, you need to put that first and foremost, that you have in mind the user's experience. And there's a couple easy ways to do that. I think it was Lauren Kessler, from the product owner from PinFed in the previous panel, who was saying, service design, journey maps, like, you need to figure out what that actual user experience is like. So that's one. The next one is how to bring that voice of the user into a federal space. And one thing that we found that works really well is to, with the permission of the user, to record that user trying to use the old system, right? And if you're dealing with a veteran, they might talk about things in terms of like, this is like going around a mine-loaded path, with IEDs. That's their vocabulary. And bringing that in to the people who are trying to get the work done and sometimes don't have that direct connection with the user can be incredibly effective at cutting through barriers, figuring out how to get through this policy, all those things. And then the last point I would say is just find a good champion. And those sort of recordings and videos and audio can be a really good way to help find that champion. But oftentimes, take Sonny Perdue, for example, head of Department of Agriculture. He is leaning in on trying to do transformational change. Like, there's no lack of will or support from all the way up to try to figure out how do you make things better for farmers. So you can be, laboring in obscurity, trying to find, the executive support and stakeholders, or you can try to galvanize those folks with recordings, with audio, that sort of stuff. But finding that champion who then is going to help make the user unavoidable is just critical in our experience.
I mean, just you using your term vocabulary, that's such a critical piece too, because when you bring digital services, IT, and customer experience people together, a lot of times they're saying the same thing, but they're using totally different words. So that's a good point.
I'd say that this is a great question, and my first item that I'm about to say is in line with what you heard. I call it internally a digital strategy, and for Sean and I and David, we talk about this. How do we make IT modernization move faster? And it's default to default to digital. When faced with a consumer need, how do you figure out how do you do it digitally first? The default today is come into the call center, or come into the field office, or call the call center, fill out a form. And that's, I think, across government. And that's not because that's history, that's culture, that's how we think service should be done. It's person one-to-one person. But it's not always that way. And I'm not saying that service needs to go away. In fact, that service, it's not about, by going to digital, it's more service, not less service. So defaulting to digital doesn't certainly means doing the journey maps and figuring out what that CX should be. But I actually think that the thing that keeps me up at night and what I think we need is an assertion by leadership, by agency leadership and on down from agency leadership that says we will default to digital. Once that's done, and once it's no longer the legacy channels of choice, then I think things will change. Things do start to change. Because I think what I've found, we have great employees at SSA, great folks in the front lines. They know what the right answer is. And they know how to deliver the services that the American taxpayer needs. But the challenge is, how do they get it done? They can't get it done because they're shackled. You can't get it shackled because they don't have that directive that says go digital. I think if we can do that and really make it, be the first digital government, be the first digital agency, et cetera, that's going to go a long way. And the second,
Sorry. Well, everyone has mentioned the importance of design, and I know many folks in this room are in the contracting community, so I would almost just kind of be interested, in your companies, by show of hands, how many people have on staff user experience researchers? Okay, and UX designers? Great. Well, that's good. I mean, I think that's a capability that we have seen has been missing, and to be honest, in this workforce. And the government hasn't been asking for it for sure, so it's our fault really. But I think that's something that's changing fast, and so we're looking for people to level up their skills in product design, user experience, user research, to help take the insights from a customer and translate those into things that an actual engineering team can quickly implement. That's such a critical skill to modern technology, and it's something that the typical workforce that's been working for the federal government just hasn't really had in our experience. So we're looking for more. Sorry, go ahead.
Makes the both the digital more effective.
Well, it does, but his point about the skills is actually my second point. We've been working together. It's what we have, what I would say would be an IT workforce strategy. So what, we have an IT workforce that was engineered for the last 20 years, right? But how do we now reorient it for the next 20 years, 30 years? What are those skills like? Product management being one of them, and we've had this conversation before. The service design element, and the list goes on. And so again, it's not about decreasing the workforce, it's not about any of that, it's about how do we reskill them to be able to deliver on this new digital by default approach. And then the third thing I'd say is we talk about the front end customer experience, maybe the employee experience, but there's a lot of stuff in the back that needs to be figured out. And I think we can't forget about that. So, but you also can't just do that and not do anything in the front and not give the value. So how do you balance that every day? So that's a big challenge. I think the challenge for modernization is how do you do the crosswalk from where we are today to where we are in the future, and how things in the back end will change. Or sometimes they won't, right? It's a business decision. It should be a business decision. Maybe it doesn't make sense for it to change, but it stays the way it is. It's a great workload, stable, works, keep it the way it is, and not make the modern, quote, modern migration. So I mean, that's how I think about it.
And all good feedback from all of you. I'm going to open it up to the audience right now for questions, since we've got about 20 minutes, like 15 minutes left. So.
Hi there, good afternoon. Liz Herman with Accenture. I've heard a lot of the panels talk about UX and design, and I think that's really important, and people have touched on change management. What I want to ask about is knowledge management, because that's something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's what I'm involved in at USDA in the Center of Excellence. So can any of you just maybe speak to, through this transformation, how you are harnessing knowledge, not only for your internal employees, but your customers as well? Anyone can speak on any, knowledge management perspective.
I'll take a crack at it. My first answer would be not well yet. I agree with you. It's a really important part of changing that experience. And we have, our frontline employees have a lot of information in their heads. And how do we capture that and make it so that you can replicate that, but they can work on higher value touches, not on the rote stuff that they may do additionally, which is an important point to make. So I don't think we do it well yet, we haven't figured it out, but it's an important precursor to do anything that's different when it comes to better service delivery. I will say one other thing, when we talk about, we hear about AI and machine learning, but these things are really important for some sort of better service delivery. But if you don't have better knowledge management, you can't do better AI, you can't do machine learning. Some would argue that the whole idea of AI and machine learning is not to have taxonomy that has information organized in the right way. That's the whole point. But that's actually, I would argue against that. I think you've got to figure out a way to work within what you got. So that's my
Honestly, I think it's such a hard problem that I have not seen a technology be able to solve it. Maybe I just haven't seen it yet, but the single thing that I think has been most effective at solving that problem is making it easier for those people that have the knowledge in their heads to talk to each other. So just collaboration tools that put vendors and government employees and people in all different orgs in one space where someone can ask a question and someone can see that and connect them to the person that might know it or just answer it right there. So just like real-time chat tools, I think, honestly, it's not, there's a whole ecosystem I know of like really awesome knowledge management products, and I've seen a lot of them tried and none of them have worked. The one thing that I have seen work is just getting a human connected to another human faster, which is super low tech, but that's the only thing that I've seen work.
I think it's part of our federal data strategy. if you read the document that just came out recently, it's not about just data elements, it's about information sharing and the ability to cross-reference between multiple communities of interest, to be able to ask a question and to search for the answer, both from a human standpoint and also from a documentation standpoint. So all of these things we were talking about that we're trying to document, those will be best practices, they will be accessible, they will be open to the public. That's the kind of knowledge management. And then having the person that actually worked to develop those best practices and documentations and the references that were used to do that be accessible from a human standpoint. So, okay, this was written by so-and-so, it used these principles that were published in these kinds of documents and this kind of reading material. To be able to do that research to answer any question or any problem that you might have. I mean, we had, at the very beginning when I came into OOB, we had a compendium of policies that were 20 years old, that were extraordinarily outdated, and the very first thing we did was look for some kind of a search schema that would ferret all of those things out by topic, and then to start cleaning up the closet of the things that were no longer relevant, and then identifying the gaps of things that didn't exist, going after those policies and setting that platform for all of the things that we've just put out recently that we consider foundational for IT modernization.
I'll just add a +1 to Rajiv that it tends not to go that well. And I will also say, having worked at Google and how they do knowledge management, like it was not all that especially great. It's more like smart people with stuff locked in their brain, and then a +1 to Charles' point, like making it easier to connect people, because otherwise, like at the US Digital Service, for a long time we had 2 tools approved. One was email and one was GitHub. Well, it turns out trying to teach designers and talent recruiters how to use GitHub, not the best fit for everybody. It's like, here's a screwdriver, go nail that into the wall. Or an outlet or something. It didn't work that great. Whereas when we started to get online collaboration tools, people could at least say, hey, who's the right person, and find, you know, the hub or spoke or right person to ask at least. But I wouldn't say that private industry, like even the tech industry, has done a great job at this.
Well, if Google doesn't do it well.
Yeah. Oh man.
The one
got a real
product,
issue.
I think, you know, that in the tech industry, there's Stack Overflow. So if you Google any sort of programming question, chances are you're going to see a question and answer from Stack Overflow. And I think that model, I don't know if it would work for other use cases.
Use the web as information.
Anyway,
Thank you.
Yeah, we found that in both HUD and USDA, through the COEs, so I think it sounds like they may find them in the subsequent COEs as well, agencies.
I just had a question for the panel. Do you actually see mainframe really going away?
The question was,
It's
did you
getting
see
real
mainframes
now.
going away?
So the question was, do you actually see mainframe going away? It's fantastic that there's this HUD project that is looking at translating COBOL into Java and see how that works. I will dip into a little bit of USDS aspect of things. So we are engaged at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and so they have a mainframe. It's, 40-year-old code, 8 lines of COBOL, that sort of stuff. And they're doing an interesting approach where rather than trying to monolithically translate all the COBOL to Java and then see how it works, but you can't read the Java, or the Java is COBOL flavored, and so it's not all that. They're trying an idea where they say, let's just take out one module, like the pricing module, put that in the cloud, actually have the mainframe talk to the cloud. It's like 5 times faster to 7 times faster. So the whole thing can run a little bit. And over time, that's like a 5 or 10 year project. But if you build up those muscles to be like, okay, let's take one small piece and move it out, like that is one approach. And then the other approach is just transpiling COBOL into Java and see how much that works, and then you rewrite the hotspots. We have to explore this space, right? We're spending so much money on legacy support. The folks who understand how to make changes when there's new regulations, new laws, all that stuff, those folks are retiring. And so we need to have a solution. I really like that the TMF is like putting down a few chips to try to explore, because the existing thing is just not sustainable for a long period of time.
I'll add by saying that in addition to, in Matt's turn, +1, I'll add by saying that it has to make business sense, whether you move and how you move and when you move. It's not just march on and move off. So we do have to find a way to reduce the dependence on the mainframe, but it may not make sense for everything. It may make sense for certain things, depending on what the workload is, and what the cost is, and what the risk is, and what the eventual benefit's gonna be. So it has to be thoughtful, and it's certainly not one size fits all.
We aren't the only ones struggling with this. The banks
Oh, yeah.
are heavily invested in mainframe and COBOL. So any place where you have an extraordinarily high transaction volume on a 24/7 basis, you're going to find that they're facing the same challenges. I like the modular plug and play aspect because I don't think you can do it all at once. Right? Usually just pulling out microservices, and then eventually you get down to that really hard nugget core that you actually have to refactor. That's one way to do it. And that's the way we approached it at DHS. But still, this is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be there a little while.
I know that a lot of what we talked about has been different ways of working, things like user-centered design and iterations, what have you. In all the experimentation you've seen, have you seen any agencies that have been especially effective in helping their employees make that shift? Because you're really asking them to work differently as well as the technology to work differently.
I would just give a +1 to the Department of Education. U.S. Digital Service, for various reasons, had to withdraw, but like early on in the administration. But we did a design thinking workshop on our way out the door, and really, they recently presented at a sort of a large group event, and the stuff that they're doing, like they are really leaning in pretty heavily on like, okay, how do we get human-centered design? How do we do those sorts of things? So like, there's a lot of different agencies who are actually, trying to think hard about how do we bring some of these modern techniques, because as long as you are close to the user, you can't get too far off base. And so it's pretty interesting to see that.
I think. Arthur?
Oh, Kathy.
Don't worry about that. I'll just stand up. So, I love your emphasis on really understanding the problem to be solved. How do you deal with the reality that often, as you dig into user needs, you find that there's an underlying problem that has to be served, has to be addressed first? So how much flexibility do you have to help people understand that reframing the problem and redefining it is not just okay, but often necessary?
I think that you always, as long as you can show progress fast, I think that buys you a lot of runway. And so one thing that a business partner never wants to hear is, oh, that thing you asked us for is a dumb idea because we talk to users. And really the problem is your whole law underpinning your office, it doesn't make any sense.
That's not a hit.
Yeah, that doesn't go super well, right? But and user experience designers, they're trained to identify the problem, not just do the project plan. So that's what we want. But then I think it's kind of our job as product managers to weigh the feedback and then the realities and try to figure out what can we do in the next couple of weeks to make this a little bit better. And then just keep going down that path, and eventually you build momentum towards solutions that can solve the underlying problem. So I think basically not getting too hung up on those big root cause problems so much that you're paralyzed and can't start, because often there's something you could do, and in so many ways the hardest part is just starting and just I think delivering improvements regularly. That kind of is the strategy. There just is no more. It's not more complicated than that. We kind of make it more complicated than that. But if you can just pick a problem and figure out what metric you're trying to improve and then work on improving it, like in a matter of weeks, and get those increments going, there's nothing else you can really do, I don't think.
Yeah, it's the reimagination of the delivery of the service. It doesn't have to be a better version of what you're doing today, but to completely reimagine the way you deliver something, like revolutionizing the transportation industry with the kind of personal transportation that we have today versus taxi dispatch. I mean, who would have thought that the problem was not about better taxi dispatch? It's about completely personalizing the experience and having it be advantageous to the traveler, that the transportation is available where you need it, when you need it.
Kathy,
Yeah, no,
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
Kathy, I'd say that I've rarely found a situation where you start down a problem path and then say, oh, this is the wrong direction. It's usually, hey, there's a lot more here to solve than what meets the eye. So I would say that my first inclination would be solve the problem you started out solving, and stay focused on that, and then know that you have other things to solve. And to me, I mean, not the assumption in some use cases I'd make is, hey, you're solving this customer segment's problem. That's it. And you know that there's like 15 other ones you got to solve. So you're right, though. I would say rarely I would find that it's the wrong problem. It's usually the problem. It just may not be as broad as you might think it is.
Something that just it comes up a lot is like when you find those underlying problems are these big, hairy like policies or worse is like laws. Sometimes you just get so overwhelmed that you don't know what to do. But this is something I've gained with more wisdom of being in public service for, I guess, now like 6 years, which is longer than I ever expected. But it's totally awesome. You all should definitely do it. But the thing you can do about a bad policy is start fixing it. And even if it's going to take 3 years to finish, it's better to start today because then in 3 years it's going to be fixed. So you also don't want to just ignore those. Like, take 3.0. It's a long journey,
Yeah,
but
TIC is a really
I'm glad we
good
started it
example.
a couple of years ago instead of starting it now, right?
Yeah, we started a couple of years ago, and we started with those small increments of change. The first one being showing people that we are taking a risk management approach to cybersecurity, and that we are working that through NIST, and we are actually putting that on paper, and we're allowing people to choose different solutions other than those prescripted at an enterprise level, as long as you are achieving the intent and the capability of what the security was intended to provide, then we don't care how it gets delivered. Taking that risk, being able to step out of a prescripted box was the first step we took. And then doing pilots, saying, okay, how does this work? If we're not going to do TIC, we're going to do some other kind of security in the cloud and between clouds and between on-prem and cloud. How do we pilot those? And working with US Census and others who have an immediate need. Obviously, they're going into Census 2020. They have to be able to work in the field. They have to have a seamless security constructor in place. So all of those things are little small increments of actually going and taking action and having an outcome, even though the policy itself is not out the door yet. That will be kind of the bow in the final analysis, but we've been taking action throughout those years that we've been talking about it. We've been taking action. We're improving FedRAMP. We're trying to go to continuous authorization as opposed to the Big Bang Theory every 3 years. All of those things are getting done. They're just getting done in smaller chunks.
I think your question is exactly on point because oftentimes you run up against these kind of challenges. And just to synthesize a little bit, like I have a friend who says the goal of political capital is not to build up political capital and admire it. The goal is to spend that political capital. And so you create momentum, you fix the small things, and then that helps you build up the reputation, the karma, the whatever that will let you fix the bigger things. To the point where like as a White House employee, I use a pay system that the government uses called BFAS. I got an email this morning that's like, you got to change your password because you have to change your password every 150 days. And now we're like, okay, just keep that list of annoyances. Like, what are the irritations that you have? And maybe someday we'll like go find the right DFAS person and be like, look, the NIST policy guidance has changed now. You don't need to change that password. Just let me keep my password, And so sometimes it's something small. And sometimes it's gonna be something big, and you'll go talk to staffers in Congress or whatever, but don't give up. Like, let's keep the list of all those sharp edges, and maybe someday we won't have to change our password maybe we won't have timeouts. If anybody is interested in timeout-related issues, NIST is looking for feedback. Come find me later. I will give you a tweet where you can go say, yes, I shouldn't time out.
I'm talking about like system timeouts, not like toddler timeouts.
Yeah.
Even toddler timeouts.
Both are challenging, both are challenging.
Well, I think we are out of time, so please join me in thanking Margie, Charles,